Hello, ladies and gentlemen, dear colleagues, dear guests in the audience of our Zoom webinar, dear audience on YouTube. Welcome to our digital event, Terrorism for White Supremacy, Comparative Research Perspectives on Right-Wing Extremist Terrorism, hosted by the Institute of Democracy and Civil Society, IDZ, Jena, Germany. My name is Axel Salheiser. I switched off my camera now to get the presentation going. Sorry for that. I am a research coordinator at IDZ. IDZ, the Institute of Democracy and Civil Society in Jena, Germany, is an interdisciplinary research unit in a division of Amadeo Antonio Stiftung, Amadeo Antonio Foundation of Germany. IDZ is funded by the Ministry of Education, Youth, Sports of the German state of Thuringia, and we focus on public social science investigation, investigating the trajectories and mechanisms of far-right politics, strategies, ideology, and radicalization. We also research into hate speech and social media discourse, group-focused enmity, discrimination, hate crimes, and other challenges of society diversity and inclusion in a pluralistic democratic society. This said, IDZ is also the Jena Department of Risk, the Research Institute on Social Cohesion, funded by the German Federal Ministry of Education and Research. Yeah, please visit our website for further information and for our open access publications on those topics. Including a volume on right-wing terrorism and also our new journal for the research into the far right for our German-speaking readers. Ladies and gentlemen, tonight's event is also supported by sponsorship of the German Federal Agency for Civic Education, Bundeszentrale für politische Bildung, so thanks for that. And we are streaming this Zoom webinar live on YouTube tonight, and we are also proud to welcome, of course, our four presenters from the United States, the United Kingdom, Norway, and Germany, whom I'd like to introduce to you just in a minute. But let me first explain that we will have our four presentations in a row tonight. And after that, we will go on with the discussion, and guests in the audience of the Zoom webinar and in our YouTube channel are invited to post their questions and comments in the respective chats from now on. And we will collect them and hope to cover them all in the later discussion. Ladies and gentlemen, dear guests, please welcome our four guests who are experts in the field of research into the far right, radicalization and terrorism. Cynthia Miller-Idriss is professor at the School of Public Affairs and School of Education and Department of Justice, Law and Criminology at American University in Washington, D.C. She is also director of research at the Center for University Excellence and director of the Polarization and Extremism Research and Innovation Lab, ARRL, at American University. Cynthia is the author of the Princeton University Press bestseller, Hate in the Homeland, The New Global Far Right. Thank you very much for being with us tonight, Cynthia. I should switch off the presentation now better. Sorry.
Do you want me to, should I start right away, or will we do introductions just to make sure I'm not interrupting the order of things?
No, I would introduce everybody in the beginning.
Okay.
Also, please welcome Ashton Kingdon. Ashton is a professor, is a PhD candidate in web science at the University of Southampton and a research fellow at CAR, Center for Analysis of the Radical Right. Her research is combining criminology, history, and computer science to explore the ways in which right-wing extremists utilize technology for recruitment and radicalization, whilst giving equal weight to the subcultural elements of the uses of this technology. Thanks for coming, Ashton. Jakob Aasland Ravndal is a research fellow at CREX, the Center of Research on Extremism at the University of Oslo, Norway. His PhD thesis investigated the evolution of right-wing terrorism in post-Second World War Western Europe. Jakob's work focuses on intergroup radicalization, strategies of right-wing revolutionary resistance, among other aspects. Glad you could make it tonight. Maik is a researcher at Institute for Democracy and Civil Society. He is a doctoral candidate in the Department of Political Science at Goethe University, Frankfurt, and he is also a fellow at CAR, the Center for Analysis of the Radical Right. Maik's research fields include far-right movements, violence and terrorism, and digital fascism, and he's authored and co-authored or edited several articles and volumes on these matters. Thank you for being with us too. Ladies and gentlemen, dear guests, needless to say that the topic which brings us together today is an important and a complex one. Far-right terrorism has become an alarming global trend. It has taken hundreds of lives. It has shaken societies and left communities in sorrow and fear. And it continues to endanger the lives and health of all those who become targets of neo-Nazi, racist and anti-Semitic bigotry, militant hatred and violence. This panel is part of Kein Schlussstrich, a current series of public, cultural and scientific events commemorating and discussing the crimes in the history of the so-called NSU, the so-called National Socialist Underground, a far-right terrorist unit and network that was discovered 10 years ago after having committed 10 murders all over Germany. Most of them due to a racist motivation, and one victim was a police officer. Besides bomb attacks with dozens of heavily injured victims, bank robberies and other crimes in Germany since the end of the 1990s and throughout the 2000s. The main members of NSU originated from Jena, Germany, from where they had submerged in the late 1990s, thus escaping Thuringian and national police authorities. And from then on, they had been intensifying their terrorist activities from their newfound home base in nearby Zwickau, Saxony. Throughout this decade of terrorism, Secret Service agencies kept track and actually collected a lot of information about the NSU and its support networks, but they continued to hold back this information and even impeded the police investigations back then. Why the National Socialist Underground terror network was on this killing spree throughout the country, the victims themselves, who came from immigrant communities, were denied support and empathy from the authorities. They experienced racialist stereotyping, criminalization, and secondary victimization by the police, and they witnessed a blatant failure of German state and society. This scandal, while unparalleled in German history after 1945, was only one tip of the icebergs floating through the sea of modern German society, talking about racism and neo-fascist violence, including the inadequate reactions and deficit learnings. With racist, anti-Semitic and anti-democratic ideology spreading on the internet, and new ways of radicalization via social media, right-wing extremist terrorism has modernized since then. It has become a worldwide trend, of course, and in Germany, epitomized by the deadly attacks of Munich, Hanau, and Halle-Saale, and the killing of politician Walter Lübcke in more recent times. All those crimes share the very same ideology and ideological root of white supremacy, agitation, racist bigotry, and the urge to choose drastic measures and, quote, to take action where others just talk, unquote. Ladies and gentlemen, dear guests, the recent days have also been overshadowed by two fatal incidents in Europe, i.e. the killing of British Conservative Member of Parliament David Amess and the attack of Kongsberg, Norway, leaving 5 dead last week. Both cases, although not connected to right-wing extremism, again, raised the questions of individual or collective thought, of individual or collective aspects of radicalization, of the interplay of radical ideology and possible psychopathology as drivers of violence attacks, as well as the challenges or failures of early prevention and intervention strategies of law enforcement, security institutions, as well as the responsibility of politics and society. It is crucial to differentiate and to underline the specific threats caused by right-wing extremist terrorism and its multifaceted social, societal, and political contexts, which have to be thoroughly investigated from an international comparative perspective. Thus, I'm looking forward to our presentations and to the later discussion. And we start off with our first of our 4 presentations now. And dear Cynthia, now the stage is yours. Welcome again.
Great, thank you so much. Thank you for that kind introduction and wonderful introductory remarks. And thank you to the Institut for Demokratie and Zivilgesellschaft and to the Amadeo and Antonio Stiftung for hosting this event, and to my fellow co-panelists whose work I much admire and I know I will learn a lot from. So I really look forward to listening to their presentations. I'm going to share my screen here, so hopefully this will come up right away, and then just get the. Sorry, is it available to you? Can you see it? Okay, good. Great. So I want to talk.
Excuse me, sorry. Yes. We don't see the full screen. It's.
Let's see. Let me just let me stop share and do that again. I got a weird message saying it was paused. So let's just try this one more time. I must have hit something unusual. And we'll try that. How's that? Better?
Yeah, great. Thanks.
Okay, good.
That's good.
All right. So I'm going to talk I thought since I'm going first, what I would do is talk about a part of my book, the recent book, Hate in the Homeland, that talks about the growth of online youth culture in general and how it fosters global white supremacist extremism and even calls to violence. I do want to note that this presentation includes some offensive images and propaganda. I include that both to say that they are offensive, and I apologize for that, but I think it's important to share a little bit of what's happening, but also to ask that if you screenshot this presentation and tweet it out or share it on social media, please take something from a screen that is not further propagating and sharing the propaganda. That sometimes happens, and I'd like to avoid that. So when I talk about this global online ecosystem, the sort of vast and growing, ever expanding ecosystem of ways that extremists connect online, and particularly across the white supremacist extremist space, there are a number of different ways that happens, and I'm only going to be able to talk about 3, so I want to keep my remarks relatively brief here. I will talk about exposure and amplification. I'll talk about the weaponization of humor, and then I will briefly touch on the way that this builds resources. But just to say that there are other aspects that I touch on in the book in this chapter that I won't get into. So when I'm talking about exposure and amplification, here I'm really talking about when, what we've seen this for a long time, but it really became especially obvious in the Christchurch terror attack with the live streaming, the gamification of that terror attack, the using a kind of GoPro video helmet, using a video that allows a viewer to watch through a live stream and even contributes further to the way that terrorism becomes a kind of global performance or acts as political theater. We've seen that as well recently in nonviolent incidents. In my own neighborhood, in the Politics and Prose bookstore a couple of years ago, a white supremacist group interrupted a book talk from a professor and kind of took over and shouted, you know, this is our land, etc. But the important part about it was that they videotaped it. They brought a videographer with them and then put it up on their website for you know, for later viewing and as a sign of their action. So this kind of not just live streaming at the time, but then recording it and resharing it. So even when it's, you know, taken down, these things live on. But there's also this vast expanse of places and spaces online where people can share content, both through vlogs, videos, podcasts, talk shows, but also in new platforms or newer platforms like TikTok, and image sharing platforms like Instagram, ways that a wide variety of online spaces are being used across different generations to connect, to communicate in ways that help recruit, radicalize, communicate, and mobilize toward violence. It also brings new audiences because a lot of what's happening is the content shows up where people are in their lives. So in makeup tutorials, drywall installations, construction tutorials, cooking shows, there are any number of places where both extremist groups can introduce content in a kind of deliberately grooming sort of way, but also you have a really organic ability to produce that content just as any ordinary individual and add that in. So it's really broadened and expanded the way that people can connect with this. And what this essentially does, and as I trace in my book across a number of chapters, is create new spaces and places to cultivate different kinds of capital for extremist groups and extremist movements, both financially, but also culturally, intellectually, and even physically. And so the physical example I want to give you is in the mixed martial arts, but we have Instagram accounts and cooking shows and examples of attacks on higher education here as well that I won't get into. When we talk about the mixed martial arts, one of the things we've been seeing, of course, I should always say the vast majority of people who practice and engage in combat sports have nothing to do with extremist scenes or movements, but the mixed martial arts in particular and other combat sports are also being, you know, co-opted by extremist groups and movements because they align in many ways with the messaging around defense of the homeland. It's a kind of a recruitment of people out of a more less disciplined and drunken hooligan type of scene into a more straight edge lifestyle in which physical violence and a kind of hypermasculinity is cultivated. So these are scenes from some, not all clubs are still open here, but in Ukraine, in Canada, in France, we've got them in a variety of other countries. And what you have are, you know, very clear statements from the founders of some of these networks, of tournaments, of merchandise sites, and lifestyle brands that are associated with this, that talk about the way that these tournaments and the mixed martial arts itself are a strategy, a tactic to draw athletes into the world of ideas, to develop them ideologically, to bring them in first through even very positive kinds of emotional cues like solidarity or brotherhood, camaraderie, and strength, and then introduce these ideas. But it's also a lot of negative kinds of concepts, so not just the positive ones, but an alternative to or a counter to, essentially, a counter-cultural approach to challenge mainstream society as a decaying political system and to violently turn against sort of the system of what one festival calls the system of losers, hypocrites, and weaklings. And it has been described on some of these websites of festivals and merchandise sites as really key to the defense of the nation, the homeland, the clan, one's people. So it is a very closely linked kind of thing. The second thing I want to talk about is the weaponization of humor and the weaponization of youth culture. And so we began to see this, you know, even before it became really widespread online through memes. We really began to see it, of course, in t-shirts, which I had been studying for a long time, in the iconography of t-shirts. And so this example from Dortmund in 2016, you know, was a trolling attempt against a anti-racist group who had been using a logo adapted from Run DMC, an American rap group from the 1980s. But they took the German word for swastika, Hakenkreuz, and put it into that Run DMC logo, removed the vowels, And of course, then a large legal discussion emerged about whether a word is still a word if the vowel is removed. If this had been the full word, it would have been illegal. It turns out it's not illegal. One of the things that's important about this is not only did that spur, of course, a lot of other coding content across Germany because of specific German legal bans around words and the display of certain symbols, but it also migrated across borders. So we saw t-shirts show up in the US, for example, that used the same kind of idea, even though it wouldn't be illegal or banned to do that here. And even though the code is very clear, white boy, on a brand like this. So you began to see that kind of co-opting and sharing of things across borders. And of course, that it is a widespread kind of tactic, both in the t-shirt you see in the bottom of the screen and also in the distributor. This is a French distributor, which if you sound it out, it's too white for you, that sells a number of brands across from Ukraine, from Germany, from other countries here as well. So that t-shirt iconography was one part of this weaponization of humor, but another part is the use of these memes that are a much more organic way of connecting racist and extremist and white supremacist content from the bottom up. So anybody can produce these memes. So in this case, of course, Pepe the Frog, which got co-opted early on by the so-called alt-right in the US for a long story of how that happened and why, sort of inexplicable reasons. But what I want to share here is that it evolved over time into a meme, into a sort of fantasy state called Kekistan, again, for complicated reasons related to the way that online laughter is expressed in online gaming, KEK instead of LOL. Someone discovered that there's an Egyptian god of the frogs named Kek, and so Pepe became Lord Kek, and the country, this Republic of Kekistan, this magical sort of white ethno-state would be the Republic of Kekistan. But it has a flag, okay? All of that sounds completely ridiculous, easy to dismiss. It's just a bunch of adolescents being silly online, except then the flag, the Kekistan flag, starts to show up in very real places where there's violence. So we have here in the upper left-hand side, Charlottesville, the Unite the Right rally in Virginia, and the lower left in Brazil, at a far-right demo, in the center, the bottom, at the US Capitol on January 6th. So you begin to see that flag representing essentially a white ethno-state or a call for a Republic of Kekistan, which emerges from a meme created by a bunch of teenagers online, show up in violent contexts in offline spaces. So, where many people might dismiss what's happening with youth, online is sort of just a joke. Not only is it motivated by what's happened offline earlier in their lives or what they're seeing offline, but it also then directly can kind of mobilize violence. And I think it's an important part of what we've been seeing that often gets neglected. And of course, Maik has worked on this quite a bit with the online to offline context, and hopefully you'll hear more about that later. Finally, I just want to close by talking briefly about, this isn't just about online culture. It's not just about t-shirts or iconography or the weaponization of humor or the way that people share things online in terms of ideas. These online connections have very real consequences for the way that resources are built, for the sharing of training and tactics and manuals and global networks. So we see, of course, a lot of crowdsourcing of funds and fundraising and financing of groups, both with kind of performative initiatives or actions like this Defend Europe chartership a few years ago, which costs a couple of $100,000 or euros and was crowdsourced across at least 8 countries with donations online, but also legal defense funds that are crowdsourced, the use of advertising features and pay-per-view features and subscriptions, of donation and crowdsourcing of donation funds that cut across borders, that raise money in support for each other's actions, that help mobilize, that fund initiatives. We see joint training efforts, people coming across borders to join training camps, to participate in these mixed martial arts tournaments, et cetera. And then we also see of course, the global networking and attempts to emulate one another, both through the kind of saint and disciple language that we often see, and comparisons to each other's kill counts, of course, which is a horrific concept, but the idea that they're kind of competing with one another for martyrdom, for renown, and also admiring each other's in terms of the actual terrorist actors and most violent actors acts across borders as well. So again, just really important to consider the ways in which this isn't just, I often hear, or I used to hear, actually, I much more rarely hear this now, but I used to hear from reviewers, from funders who I was applying for funding, things like, you know, aren't these just kids being kids? I was a punk too in the 80s, you know, I grew out of it. Won't they grow out of it? And interestingly, I do not hear that very much anymore, but I think there has been a tendency to dismiss some of the youth culture that's happened online as just youth culture. And we've seen, I gave you the example here of the Pepe the Frog, but in the US, we also saw the Boogaloo meme emerge from a group of teenagers online and then motivate murders in the summer of 2020 by actual Boogaloo boys who believed that they were, and still believe that they are fighting in advance of a coming civil war. So it's a code war for civil war. So there are multiple examples of where these kind of instances of youth culture that really organically emerge, often as jokes, can also mobilize violence, and then, of course, the resources and training. So I'll stop there. I just want to say that I run a research lab, which I didn't talk about. We have a number of resources and tools for interventions, which are all free to download. The website is woefully out of date, but we're trying to fix that. And also my own personal writing and essays, which can also be accessed through open source links on my website there. So please do reach out if you to those websites if you would need additional information. And I'll stop sharing and look forward to listening now.
Thank you very much. Thanks, Cynthia, for your presentation. And we just go on with Ashton Kingdon's presentation. Ashton,
yeah, I'm just going to share my screen. Oh, it says I cannot. There we go.
You can now.
Now I can. So, can everyone see my screen? Yes?
Yes, yes.
Yeah, okay.
Perfect.
Thank you so much for having me here. It's such a privilege to be among such esteemed company. I followed the other people on the panel for a long time. So it's a privilege to be here. And I will also say, as Cynthia did a cheeky disclaimer, so I also have propaganda in my PowerPoint, so just to warn everyone. So yeah, I have just submitted my thesis. I spent 4 years undercover in different white supremacy networks. I look at things like the role of technology as an accelerant of radicalization, specifically looking at alt-tech platforms, and also the role played by emerging technologies such as artificial intelligence and the quantum internet. But today I'm going to talk to you about Web 1.0 forums and the research that I collected on particularly Fascist Forge. So I spent about 8 months on Fascist Forge between 2019 and 2020. When I was on there was 1,188 users like myself, and there were 283 full members. So I'm going to break that down a little bit so we can think about who would become a full member. So my account, and I'm happy to talk about the ethics of this in the future discussion, I was posing as a National Socialist and also an esoteric Hitlerist. So those of you that will know my work will know that I focus a lot on the links between Nazism and the occult. So I was specifically looking at those kind of relationships on the forum. So when you join Fascist Forge, in order to become a full member, you have to sit an exam. And they are very serious about this. And the exams always get marked on a Friday. They were very specific about that. And the kind of things you would have to answer: what are your thoughts on Jews? There's homosexuals on there. Some really, really in-depth, intense stuff. For ethical reasons, I did not become a full member. I could gather the information that I needed through non-participant observation and analysing other people's answers to these questions. So I could not, as a researcher, be allowed to say these kind of things to trick them to get into the platform. Now, some of the things that you would have to do in order to answer these questions was read a lot of literature. So all of Siege by James Mason, George Lincoln Rockwell, all of the literature that had previously come from Iron March, which was the kind of predecessor to this platform. So they are not mucking around. You have to have really intense, in-depth knowledge about fascism, historical as well, in order to be able to pass this exam. So you pass the exam, you introduce yourself to the forum. So including questions like where you're from, how you found out about Fascist Forge, why you're there, what you want to accomplish, what your interests and skills are, and your political history. And this is what we're going to break down now. So I analysed all of the answers to these questions, the questionnaire, from the 283 full members. So these are the people that have passed successfully the exam and are now talking to each other on the platform. So there are 7 active recruiters that had identified themselves out of this sample. So they were from the Atomwaffen division, the Sonnenkrieg division, Skydus, which is from Lithuania, and Anti-Pedium Resistance, which is an Australian version of the kind of neo-Nazi Atomwaffen brand. So there were 7 people that were directly telling people on the forum that they are recruiting for these organizations out of those 283. So some of the key facts, so 66% of people identified themselves as National Socialist, 53% of members were from the US, 31% from Europe, and the largest religious affiliation was this esoteric Hitlerism. So these components with occultism coming really, really prominently into the forum. So what I call the trail to terror, so how people found out about the forum in the first place. So the most significant proportion of people had already been on Iron March, right? So they were leapfrogging over to Fascist Forge after Iron March had been taken down. The next largest category was people finding out about it from an internet search, searching for more information that could be about fascist worldview more generally, or specifically for literature that was featured on the platform. Huge proportion of people came from Discord. So we're already seeing more links between the video gaming community and these kind of undercover, underground, more niche platforms. Lots of people have found out about it from an offline friend. So they were already knowing each other in real world physical space. And then the other highest sort of trail was from friends that they had met from the forum. So these were kind of the key ways that they were telling the other users that they found out about it. So what I've called Tinder for terrorists, what is it about these application forms that they are telling the audiences about themselves to appeal to these specific recruiters who have identified themselves on the platform? So the key things are 51% of accounts identified physical fitness as being a key attribute, right? So this could be running, going to the gym, basically saying that they spend a lot of time bulking up. They would specifically state this in their accounts. 47% had this kind of obsession with living off grid, survivalism, right? And this could be through things like saying that they had their own vegetable patches, their own allotments, or that they spend time in the wilderness. They specifically spend vacations off grid. This was a really big thing. And as Cynthia was mentioning in her presentation about the links, a lot of this links to the kind of idea that there is going to be a sort of end of the world collapse and a fascist state will rise from the ashes. So the accelerationists really follow this kind of need to live off grid. 73 said they were historians, right? So quite a lot of the time you'll find that people can only justify reading this kind of content because they say they have an interest in history, especially true with the kind of hardcore Mein Kampf books, things like that. 53% were, 55 members, sorry, were identifying themselves as propagandists. So this could be things like they were skilled on Photoshop, they knew how to create the propaganda images, they knew how to transmit them. A lot of people were advertising their artwork on there. 53% had computational skills. So again, this is advertising themselves in cybersecurity, being able to keep the platform safe from takedowns, being able to help them circumvent platform restrictions even further. This was something that was really, really prominent. 39 were current or ex-military. So they specifically had this kind of background. 34 were trained in martial arts. I know Cynthia has a chapter in her book about the MMA. A lot of people were advertising themselves as being trained in this particular type. 13 were experts in chemistry or had this kind of interest in eugenics, and they were advertising themselves with this particular knowledge. And those of you that will already know about the platform, one of the more insidious components of it is that there are manuals, training manuals on there advising people how to create weapons. And 10% were bilingual. So they were, again, advertising this ability to translate propaganda and reach out to different audiences. So in terms of the political history, 109 were lifers. So they had always liked and had an interest in fascism or National Socialism, and they had had those views for basically the majority of their life. 66 were what I call flip-floppers. So they were actually extremely far left, and then they flipped right over to fascist worldview. So originally anarchists, maybe Marxists, flipping over straight into sort of hardcore fascism. 39 members were using the alt-right as a gateway. So they had expressively stated that they had become interested in the alt-right, and then through the alt-right, more interested in fascism. And 25 people flip-flopped directly through there. So kind of spurred on by other members. So the motivating factors then that came from this analysis was every single member wanted to join to network, because on these particular forums, there is the most insidious conversations that I've personally seen in terms of content that I've looked at. And some of the things that they're talking about, in particular in relation to anti-Semitic content, you just wouldn't even have on platforms like Gab. So it's too extreme for those kind of platforms. 114 members were there to connect with like-minded people. 86 wanted to expand their knowledge of fascism. 59 people out of 283 were calling for offline direct actions, mobilizations from online to offline, and 18 people were directly calling for acts of terrorism. So that is out of a super small sample, quite a large amount of people that are asking for direct action and extreme acts of violence. So the interesting thing about my work in terms of how this type of 1.0 technology is dangerous still is we can use open source intelligence to data mine things. Now, the reason that this is concerning, I'm going to go into, you can see there circled, that's two specific hyperlinks. So that's fascistforge.org, which is the platform that I'm showing you now, and then fascistforge.com. So what you can see from the following slides is it's super cheap to host this domain. And it's hosted, fascistforge.com, from Burlington. Nothing strange about that, right? They've paid for a cheap hosting site and they're hosting it for a cover company in the US. Now, what's interesting is they also have a cyber squat on fascistforge.org hosting in the Cayman Islands, right? I don't know if anyone thinks anything positive ever happens in the Cayman Islands, but that's where they're cyber squatting the domain name. So essentially what this proves through data mining is that when this platform comes down, they can automatically spring back up because they're cyber squatting that domain name. So quite a lot of the time with these kind of platforms, we know from the early days of Jihad 1.0 that they are like fruit flies, right? They spring straight back up. They've got mirror sites, but if you don't whack the moles, it's going to get overgrown. So what this shows is that they actually think about this and they cyber squat for future references, so they can spring straight back up. What this information also tells us that we can use through OSINT. So I use a tool called Sherlock, which enables you to take usernames, which you can gain from the forum, run them through Python, and it will automatically tell you where those usernames come up in any other social networking sites across the internet. So for example, we'll take Pidgey, who is the main propagandist on Fascist Forge. So those of you that have seen the accelerationist propaganda, there's a very specific look. The first slide, the introduction slide on this PowerPoint had that on there. Pidgey is one of the people that makes this. So if you run his name, you can quickly see that he has very different accounts on different sites, Reddit being one of them, DeviantArt, a lot of them have accounts on DeviantArt. And you can quickly see that they are forming communities on different platforms, whether that be YouTube, social networking sites like Facebook and Instagram. Sometimes they're kind of platforms like Gab. This not only shows you a lot of time in searching for people, but also shows that there are these really sophisticated networks that have been kind of going on behind the scenes on platforms you might not even think about, like DeviantArt. So the considerations, why Web 1.0? So I've personally found that the baseline early technologies are where the most insidious people are, because they're not trying to actively recruit members like you would see on Gab, Facebook, Instagram. People are trying to come to them for the things that they offer, these really close-knit extreme communities. Why don't authorities just shut this down? As we can see through data mining, even if you do, they have the capabilities to just spring back up. It's super difficult to disrupt this once it's started. Why should we be concerned? The most concerning thing about my time on this platform was the ordinary people on there. You had primary school teachers, paramedics, people that sort of disappeared into the everyday society you would never expect. And those are the people that I saw with the most extreme anti-Semitic, accelerationist, neo-Nazi views. And they're not the people that are necessarily being looked at, nor are these platforms. So thank you so much for listening. And I look forward to any questions. I'm going to stop sharing.
Yeah, thank you very much, Ashton, for your presentation. And we already got questions, but nevertheless, we go on with Jakob's contribution. The stage is yours, Jakob.
Thank you, Axel. Thank you to Cynthia and to Ashton for two very fascinating presentations. And thank you also to the IDC and the Amadeo Antonio Foundation for organizing this event. Just the last Friday, I was participating in another commemoration event for the 22nd of July attacks, one in many here in Norway, and it's just telling how 2011 was really a critical juncture in the history of far-right terrorism, but also in the history of research on far-right terrorism. At that point, we had, I would say, much less knowledge than we have today. And so one of the things that I'm going to try to do today is to summarize a little bit what I've learned, at least over those years. So let me share my screen. Can you see my screen now?
Not yet.
Okay, so I'm on the computer of a colleague, so this is something that I suspected might happen. Just give me a moment. I suspect that it might not. Let me try another one. What about now? Yes.
Yeah, but it's not the full screen.
Now.
Yeah.
Okay, good. I was getting worried there for a second. All right. So today I'm going to talk about a data set that we are working on here at CREX. I will begin by saying just a few words about the background for this data set, what it's trying to do. Then I will highlight some of the trends in Western Europe for the past 20 years, but also speaking more in detail about the last year. Before finally zooming in on Germany, because that might be of particular interest for this particular event. So the RTV dataset really is a result not only of the 22nd of July attacks, but also the NSU events. Two extraordinary events that both occurred in 2011. And one thing that, I mean, my entering into this field of study was actually the 22nd of July attacks. And one of the early things that I noticed is that it was difficult to situate this attack into a larger picture because we just didn't have any good information about the extent of right-wing terrorism in different countries, whether it was on the rise or on the decrease and so on. And I think also, at this point in 2011, research on far-right terrorism had been quite meager for some years. It really peaked in the 1990s, I think, and during the 2000s, there was a period with not so much focus on this particular threat, much more so on the jihadist threat. So these two events really, I think, triggered a need to look more into the landscape of right-wing terrorism. And that is really what the right-wing terrorism and violence data set is trying to do. So it's covering violent events in 18 West European countries. It's entirely based on open sources. I'm also happy to announce that we're currently working on an expanded version that until now has been unavailable to the public, but we have now finally gotten approval to share it publicly. So we're just preparing that now, and we will be sharing a new data set that contains much more details than the previous version. So we're looking forward to that. The data set covers both attacks and plots, and it does distinguish itself from other existing data sets by some of its key criteria for inclusion. It's different in some senses. So where some other data sets, for instance, will include attacks perpetrated by someone affiliated with the far right, that is not really the inclusion criteria that we're aiming for. So we will include attacks, only attacks whose target selection is premised on far right beliefs. So that means regardless of the organizational affiliation of a perpetrator, if someone commits racist violence, it will be included in our data set. But secondly, we're only covering the most severe types of events. And this is certainly not because we think less severe events are less worrying. It's simply because in order to be able to systematically measure this, the universe of less severe events is just too big and too difficult to cover. So that is why we're focusing on the most severe events. Now, I wanted to show you this slide just to give you a sort of a little bit of insight into how challenging it can be to collect systematic data on violence. So on this slide, what you're seeing, the red is the fatal events, and the dotted line is representing non-fatal events included in the data set. But be mindful that they're corresponding to the right-hand side scale and not the left one. So they're actually figuring far above those red columns. In any case, what I'm trying to show with this picture is how different changes in data collection methodology impacts on the amount of events that we're able to cover. So for the first 25 years, this was a solitary project that I did all by myself. And I'm learning now more and more that, of course, there were many weaknesses in doing that and many things that I wasn't able to cover. So one of the first things that happened later on is that we were able to recruit research assistants that could help me, and that certainly improved our coverage of non-fatal events. Then we started engaging with international experts from all the countries that would help us include relevant events. And then finally, back in 2018, we started using a much more systematic approach where we use Boolean searches in large media archives. And as you can see, this renders a much higher number of non-fatal events. And this is why we, from the beginning, have been very cautious about using our data on non-fatal events to analyze trends, simply because we know that we're not able to cover the entire universe. We do think, though, that we are getting so good now that for the last couple of years, it's reasonable to also use data on non-fatal events to generalize about trends. And I will do that a bit later on. So let's look at some of the long-term trends that this data set is showing when we're looking at fatal events only. So one interesting aspect is that some countries stand out in terms of the level of violence. And as you can see clearly from this slide, Germany is certainly one of those cases. In terms of the substantive number of fatal events, Germany outscores all the other countries by far. However, we should also be mindful, of course, that Germany is a really large country. So what this slide is showing is when controlling not only for population size, but also for time. So when we control for population size, we can see that it's in fact Sweden that has the highest number of fatal events per 100,000 inhabitants, while Germany takes second place. But we can also see an interesting development, whereas less and less fatal violence is occurring in Germany. And then for the past decade, Greece has actually adopted the first place here. Now, this is, of course, also because the Greek population is quite small and they don't need that many fatal events to score high on this particular measure. But I included this just to show you that it really depends. When we see different statistics of far-right violence or terrorism in general, there's a lot of factors to keep in mind when you're sort of ranking countries or looking at developments. And so this is sort of illustrating that. This is a different way of illustrating trends since the 1990s. So each dot here represents the fatal attack, and the size of the dot represents the number of fatalities. So as you can see, the number of fatal attacks over time has been actually decreasing over time, but we're also seeing that a few number of really high casualty events have occurred over the past years. One interesting thing to note is the fact that of all attacks with 3 or more fatalities, all occurred in Germany, apart from the 22nd of July attacks. So there's 5 other attacks with 3 or more casualties. Now, these are all kinds of fatal attacks, but this seminar is really about terrorism. And of course, a lot of this violence is spontaneous. It's not really part of a terrorist campaign. So what is really terrorism? This is one of the most authoritative books on terrorism, and Bruce Hoffman has provided probably the most frequently cited definition of the phenomena. And 2 aspects that I highlighted here is just to illustrate why it is really difficult to know whether to code an attack as terrorist or not. Because not only do you have to know the aims of the perpetrator, but you also have to know whether he designed the violence to have a psychological impact far beyond the immediate victim. Because this is really hard to know, is one of the reasons why we actually didn't code events as terrorist or not for our dataset, because it's so difficult to find out. But there are a few things we can do to select events that are more likely to represent the terrorist universe. So what this slide shows are all attacks included in the dataset that were premeditated, so they were prepared, and the perpetrator used either firearms, explosives, or vehicles. So this is probably a fairly precise sample of events that most likely qualify as terrorist attacks. And what we can see is that, again, the number of attacks has been perhaps surprisingly stable over time. And we can also see here that both the NSU and the 22nd of July events pop up. And then in this particular case is the Cologne bombing that resulted in 22 people getting severely wounded. If we continue looking at this similar terrorist universe, we actually see, even when counting only the substantive number of attacks, so no longer controlling for population size, Sweden actually assumes first place with this measure. And this is partly because during the late 1990s, you had quite a few groups that were very much terrorism oriented in Sweden. They carried out a number of really, really severe fatal attacks. So when you look, if you compare Sweden to Germany, one of the things that you will see is that a lot of the violence, especially during the 1990s in Germany, was of a more spontaneous character, carried out by informal groups and gangs and so on, and skinhead gang groups. What happens if we look now at more recent times? So these are the data from 2020. And what this slide shows is actually all the events included in the dataset, fatal and non-fatal, because we're thinking that we are approaching a fairly good coverage now of this universe with our new methods. And as you can see, Germany is still figuring at the top when counting the substantive number of events. And we can also see that quite a few of the plots that occurred, or so-called preparations for armed struggle, which are events where large weapon catches are discovered by the police, occurred in Germany. But again, when controlling for population size, the picture is altered, and we can see again Greece popping up as the country that experienced most events, whereas Germany assumes the second place and is more in line with those other countries that are often within the top 5 in these different ways of counting this phenomenon. If we look at the number of fatal attacks in Germany over time, it actually looks surprisingly similar to the figure for all of Western Europe, and that is partly because Germany drives much of this development, because a lot of the violence has happened in Germany. And we also see this tendency with more mass casualty attacks over the past few years, here represented by the gray area that shows the number of fatalities per attack. But still, though, so in that sense, it's a complex picture. The number of fatal events has gone down, but the number of fatalities per attacks has gone up. If we look at the geographical distribution of attacks in Germany, a few states stand out with more attacks than others. So these are fatal attacks during the whole 30-year period. And we can see that Brandenburg is the state with the highest number, with 14 attacks. And if we look at the last couple of years in Germany, counting all kinds of events, the picture is not that much changed, but Sachsen assumes first place. And an interesting development is that Berlin, that didn't have so many fatal events for the entire period, has experienced some of the highest numbers of all kinds of events over the past 2 years. So that's probably the most notable development in terms of geographical variation in Germany. These are the kinds of perpetrator types that the dataset covers. And as you can see, for both fatal attacks and all events for the past years, a lot of the violence is committed by lone actors and gangs. But at the same time, we can see that we have a new perpetrator category introduced to the dataset this year called coordinated entities. And these are attacks where we suspect that there's some level of organization behind it, but we're just not able to prove it with the sources available. But all the sources indicate that this might be the case. So if we combine this category with the organized groups, we can see that a substantial number of events in Germany appear to be committed also by organized groups. And in that sense, Germany deviates somewhat from some of the other countries that are even more characterized by unorganized violence. When it comes to target groups, clearly the most targeted groups, both in Germany, but also in Western Europe more in general, are ethnic and religious minorities. But we can also see here some changes perhaps in targeting over time. So when we look at the diagram for fatal attacks for the entire period, we can see that a lot of the fatal attacks that have occurred in Germany targeted vulnerable groups that would typically be homeless people and so on. And this was a trend back in the 1990s. A lot of the perpetrators behind these attacks were skinhead groups and gangs who were very much embedded in a very brutal culture of violence, where just committing violence against anyone was almost like an end in and of itself. Unfortunately, these kind of attacks are not that common anymore. Otherwise, the picture is quite similar. Compared to some other countries, particularly in Southern Europe, there's less targeting against the left, but more targeting against state institutions. And if you wonder about this big area called unknown for all events, those are all the plots. And it's often difficult to know about who the target groups is for a plot, or when we just discover large catches of weapons. And I wanted to end just about some interesting plot data that we're writing about this in this year's trend report. So we noticed this interesting pattern that we have this decline in fatal attacks, but at the same time, the number of attack plots and discoveries of large weapons and caches has risen. So there's, several hypotheses that can explain this pattern. One hypothesis could be the fact that there's less attacks simply because more attacks are now stopped, which would explain the rising number of plots. Whereas another hypothesis would be that there's just more plots now because governments are paying more attention to this threat than they did before. And to sort of investigate this a little bit further, we have looked more closely at the plots, coding them into 3 different categories. So mature plots, which are plots where the perpetrator have come quite far in their planning and there's, a target selected and weapons acquired and so on. And then we have vague plots, which are plots typically where there's very little information about targeting, not really any specific plans, but still someone who gets arrested for some vague reason. And then we have these events where they just discover a lot of weapons belonging to far-right organizations. So as we can see, there's indeed been a rise in plots, in mature plots. I do, however, suspect that this may be partially caused by our improved coding. We are currently backlogging, trying to apply our improved methods back in time in order to capture more events. So we will see if the picture changes. But what we're also seeing quite clearly is this steep rise in the number of vague plots and discoveries of weapons by the police, sort of hinting at more attention from the government. And interestingly, we can see here that some of the countries that have suffered the highest level of violence are also among the countries that are experiencing the highest number of both vague plots and preparations for armed struggle, with Germany being one of them. And this, of course, is partly explained by the fact that Germany has a considerably larger militant movement than many of the other countries, with thousands of activists. So there's really much more for the police to go after than in many of the other countries. So quickly, just to sum up some conclusions based on what we've sort of been able to track for this period. Fatal violence has been decreasing both in Western Europe and in Germany, whereas terrorist violence is more stable. And probably should also mention that high fatality attacks have perhaps become slightly more common over the past years. Except for the 22nd of July attacks, all attacks with 3 or more fatalities have occurred in Germany. Germany has also experienced the largest volume of both fatal and non-fatal violence in absolute numbers, but takes second place when controlling for population size, either preceded by Sweden or more lately by Greece. Gangs and lone actors are behind most of the violence, and it's ethnic and religious minorities that are most frequently targeted. In absolute numbers, Germany experienced most mature plots, discoveries of arms caches, whereas the UK experienced most vague plots. So the UK police has been really eager about capturing people that doesn't necessarily have very, very mature attack plans. So this leads me to my final sort of, I guess, point, perhaps something to kick up some discussion. So we're seeing that some of the countries with most violence are also some of the countries with a lot of plots and vague plots, hinting at the sort of quite active repression from the side of the government. And within the terrorism literature more broadly, there's always this discussion about how repression might have different kind of effects in different settings. Sometimes it might create more violence, and sometimes it, of course, creates less violence. And I think there's really a need now to go forward and look more systematically at how different configurations of repression across different countries have impacted on right-wing violence. So that's hopefully something that we'll be working on in the future from our side. That's all from me for now, and looking much forward to the discussion. Thanks.
Thank you very much. This was a very interesting presentation as well. And yeah, let me shortly switch to my slide again, and we going over to Maik Fielitz contribution, and yeah, looking forward to your presentation, Maik. The stage is yours.
Thanks, Axel. And I also tried to share my screen. Hope it works this time now. Yeah. Is it full screen? No.
Not yet.
Not yet? Okay, wait. Okay. Now. Okay, perfect. Yeah, thanks for inviting me, and it's really a pleasure to be on this panel. I don't know if it's a burden or a relief to be the last speaking here, because so many things have already been said. I was speculating that someone would define terrorism, that someone would introduce meme cultures, then that someone would talk about fascist online networks. So really happy to build on the work of my colleagues here. And yeah, what I try at least to add is, or what I try to do is a bit to zoom out and to ask like how network digital media environments challenge our knowledge on far-right extremism. And so I will try to propose also typology, and maybe this is also a good base for discussion later on. Let me just wait. Okay, yeah. Let me just begin like some introductory remarks, like in how far we can conceptualize the change of how digital media technologies challenge our knowledge on right-wing extremism. And I try to confine myself to like 4 different patterns: organization, publicity, communication, recruitment. And I would like to discuss like how we may need to rethink some wisdoms that we had, especially on the role like that organizations play in the perpetration of right-wing terrorist violence. Basically, as Jakob also said, like the amount of lone actors has increased very much recently in the past few years. And I think it's no question that it's also the different ways how we identify different entities, like in a way mediated through digital technologies. So what is our general idea is that we have a kind of hierarchical structure, that we have in a way a kind of top-down approach, that people are acting on behalf of a group. I think this is this is like public knowledge as we imagine to be, that there's a plan and there's someone acting on behalf of the group to, in the best place, kick off a race war. This is more or less what most terrorists, right-wing terrorists, want to do. But what we see recently is very much like a change, like from much more top-down ways of communicating, of justifying violence, to a much more bottom-up process, a much more organic process that lets people take the conclusion of their own target selection, and also of their own reasoning of committing far-right violence. And what the question is very much also from much of the texts that have also already been mentioned, like in how far can we understand how people feel affiliated virtually to groups that may exist or may not even exist, but only in the mind of these far-right terrorists or terrorists in the making. So we see, like very much like in the case of Halle, and also in the case of Christchurch, that people identify with online communities that of anonymous users that don't know each other, but more or less feel affiliated through using similar ways to communicate and to express. And these are communities, as you may know, that do not have a perfect or like sophisticated ideological profile, but they are more or less the opposite. They are communities online that identify very much through the lack of ideology, but more by in a way like referring to ideological patterns that are combined to digital cultures, and in a way also to forms of expressions that have been largely unknown in the field of right-wing terrorism. So we see, like lately, since the Christchurch attack, a kind of pattern, a kind of script that has established, and that also shows that it's not necessarily an organization that needs to be behind the reasoning of far-right violence. Another point that has been changed, like through the introduction of digital media technologies, especially like social media, has been like that there's never been so much terrorist content available so quickly as we have it today. So it's basically just 2 or 3 clicks or swipes to access highly controversial or violent materials. And this is something that changed so much social media with now having a platform to be expressed and to be shared widely, not only by right-wing terrorist actors, but also by the media, by also counter-speech actors. That now the free communication of terrorist content has so much increased that it's basically everywhere available, and this is as an important part the visibility of this content is very central part of the communication strategy of terrorists. And as Cynthia said, like looking at what is terrorist content today, it's very difficult to define because we have very strong convergence of meme cultures, with humor, with online humor, with digital communities that express themselves very differently. And this also shows that it's not only for academics, but also for a security agency or platform, that it's very difficult to identify what is the terrorist content, and is someone who's sharing a terrorist content, or is this someone who's supporting the cause of this, or is it for the sake of attention, for the sake of fame? Is it the sake of newsworthiness? And so this, in this context, that how we communicate in this permanent stream of information, and this permanently networked spheres that we are all moving every day in, this is something that is largely unregulated. Even though there are ways to delete the content, there's always a way to get these materials published, and this changes a lot how people express, or like how people use terrorist measures to forward a white supremacist agenda. And lastly, in the recruitment part, and as we already seen, this way of communicating is, of course, appealing to quite new groups that use terrorist violence for the sake of white supremacy. And I think the recent attacks showed that we have now a perpetrator type that is not thinkable without the digital spaces where these perpetrators are socializing. And I just want to turn out to one case that has not been mentioned yet, and I was wondering, because it's quite recent and it has also largely been unknown to the general public, what happened in Oslo in Sweden just 2 months ago, when a 15-year-old student stabbed his teacher and was live streaming this event, the GoPro camera. And no, he was not live streaming, he was just recording. Sorry, he was recording, not live streaming. But he had a GoPro camera, he had the mask that is very much reminiscent of the Atomwaffen division. He has several codes and symbols that have been written on the weapon of the Christchurch shooter. It has been written like on his face mask. He has in his home was found like also the manifesto of the Christchurch shooter, and also quite interesting. There have been several quotations here of Stefan Ballier, the shooter of Halle. There have been a lot of materials found in his flat, and it's interesting that it's not the first time that a teenager is taking up weapons because he thinks to join the case of far-right, of white supremacists, of violent measures to achieve it. But the point is, I don't want to go too deep into the question, what are the motivations, because I think this is not, I'm not so familiar yet with the case, but what is interesting is that this all came out because the police report has been shared on 4chan poll board, and from there a new martyr has been born. And this goes so quick, and this also shows like how young people find very diverse incentives to use far-right violence and be it in a way like of being admired as a martyr, be it the gamified ways of how to communicate right-wing terrorism today. And this brings me to the question, like, how do we research and what kind of analysis can we do, like, as we have so many unknowns in the recent wave of right-wing terrorism. And there's this saying, maybe you are familiar of the prior Secretary Rumsfeld, who was pointing in his speech on the bleeding gap between perceived knowledge and factual knowledge that we have, or that in his case the government, in our case academia, has, like, between perceived and factual knowledge. He was saying back then, there are the known knowns, there are things we know. We also know there are known unknowns. That is to say, we know there are some things we don't know, but there are also unknown unknowns, the ones we don't know. So it's a bit tricky, and I tried to apply this this matrix more or less to the various phenomena that we've seen recently in this much largely digitally mediated wave of right-wing terrorism. And so we find actors that we are aware of and that we know from the activities. So I think this Combat 18 would be some case, or other terrorist cells or terrorist networks like the Atomwaffen division. So we have actors, we know what they do, they express themselves, and oftentimes we also know who are the people behind this. Then we have actors we know, but we are not totally aware of how they act and who they are. And this would be like digital networks, fascist networks, as Ashton was also pointing out to the fascist forge. There are also like fascist networks in a way of Sonnenkriegsdivision that is much less as the Atomwaffendivision, a real world organization, but much more connected through messenger services, and that have in a way communicated transnationally in several countries and under pseudonyms, and in a way like knowing of each other but not knowing who they are really. Then we have like virtual groups. I don't know if it's a perfect terminology, but what I want to say of this is our low threshold groups that do not need any kind of registration, that everyone can lurk in, that steadily raise the identification though with right-wing terrorist ideals and ways to communicate. And there is, for example, this, maybe you're aware or you heard about this, there's a kind of network of different channels on Telegram that calls themselves Terrogram. And this is quite low entrance to thinking and to the reasoning of right-wing terrorism. And these are, I would say, like open groups. They are very difficult to track because they build, they close, they rename themselves. This is the kind of rhizomatic structure that Roger Griffin has once put it, like to describe the radical right in the post-war period. A lot of groupuscles acting in very different online settings, but building up in a way a kind of identity through the way they communicate. And the unknown unknowns is the actors we are neither aware of nor do we totally understand how and when they kick off. And this is what we have seen like in Christchurch, in Halle, in Sweden now. These are lone actors that are not known to authorities, to researchers. These are totally people who communicate more or less anonymously in image boards, and it's very difficult to keep track of this. So to just, I think I don't have too much time, but just to propose a kind of ideal typical. It's not, I think, the end of what. I think it's still a work in progress. I would like to say that we have very different dimensions recently in this much digitally mediated wave of right-wing terrorism. So we have very different forms of organizational density. We have, of course, terrorist cells who build a quite strong collective identity. They need to be close to the outside. They need to protect themselves, but at the same time, we have, like, of course, in fascist networks, online networks, especially, like there is a kind of organizational identity, but as these people do rarely interact in offline spaces, their organizational density is, of course, not as strong. And then we have, like, of course, virtual groups where we have several memberships in several groups, and so, of course, organizational density is much lower and not existent for lone actors acting in these image boards and so on. In the larger context, I think it's very important to see always, like, terrorist cells acting in a larger radical milieu, as also we note from the NSU that there has not just been small cell, but there has been a whole network that these several clandestinely acting cells are depending on larger support structures, on weapons, on money, on accommodation, and so on. The same goes, of course, quite different in digital context. So I just want to pick up on kind of terrorist subculture that is, like, of course, spreading throughout platforms, and it's a whole ecology, as Cynthia also said it in her presentation. And what is interesting is that these subcultures are offering a script to act, and the script is very much it's very different from having a kind of ideologically closed and coherent way, but it's open to be adapted. It's made to be adapted. It's made to be made a meme in a way, to say, okay, we take similar structures of kind of act of violence, and we try to give it our own signature. And this is, like, what made these recent lone actor violence very characteristic, that there is a need for each perpetrator to give it a quite personal signature to also, like, be admired in large communities. And I think these are incentives that are quite new, and that is we are just at the beginning to really understand. Just a few more minutes, I just want to close with some more general considerations. So what I wanted to show, like, my presentation, was that we have quite overlapping and contradicting patterns and dynamics in right-wing terrorism, and that the tendency, I would say, is more more away from hierarchical structure and linear communication, which which is very much connected in how our digital environment or like our media environments change. And in a time where everyone can send and where we do not have a sender-receiver relation, everyone is in a way today able to build up an own terrorist group and find also people who would join them digitally. And this kind of entrepreneurial thinking that we see in various online contexts, I think this is quite dangerous, of course. It's difficult to monitor, it's difficult also to understand how these communities work. And this also shows, and I put here like a book cover, like of as we are several CAR fellows here. What I found interesting is, I mean, back then we had also like in the language of images, we had, of course, we had the boots, we have the bomber jackets, we had the skinhead profile. Today, on the cover of books, of anthologies, on the radical right, we have like the lone PC user, like often like, yeah, masked, without a face, in a dark hoodie. And this is interesting that this kind of profile is very much now dominating also the research, and it has to dominate the research of on right-wing violence, and which, I mean, which is a kind of kind of iconography that we know more like from hackers back then, and this shows already that much change. So as I said, like we have a lot of new incentives for violence, and we see in an age where especially teenagers are drawn so much into digital spaces, and also feel to get a kind of efficacy like through communicating online, that there is a certain risk that the idea of being singular, of being different, of making things that is against the mainstream and so on, that this can be a pipeline. Of course, not always, and not as a rule, but there are certain singular actors that may understand that to be singular in a totally networked society, and that is where everything is available, that right-wing violent scripts can be there for attention seeking. And I think this is, I don't want to play down the ideological part, but I think this is something that we have to have in mind in future when we want to understand why ever more young people take up arms and try to kill people. The last sentence is that even though like 10 years after Breivik and the NSU, all this, let's say, flourishing of this far-right terrorist subculture is very much also depending on the way how media, politics, and the general public is dealing with. And I think there is still not being much learned, like since 2011, how to deal with right-wing violence, how to commemorate it, and especially how not to reproduce the materials, the ideologies, the pictures that these perpetrators leave behind, and especially also the names. And so I think there's still a lot to do, and I think this can only work if there is also transnational expertise in counseling also the public sector how to handle this. All right, thanks for your attention, and I'm looking forward for discussion.
Yeah, thank you very much. And yeah, now we enter our discussion. Thanks for the presentations, and I would like to give you guys the first opportunity to react to each other. And want to ask you if you have any comments of your own presentations or respective contributions.
I have a question. First of all, thank you all. That was really, really fascinating, and enjoyed each of your presentations. Jakob, I've been wanting to ask, I've been following the development of the database, which is terrific and a useful resource to all of us. I remember a couple of years ago, we were in a discussion with someone at about whether incel violence or male supremacist violence would be included. I know it's mostly been a phenomenon in Canada and the US, but with the Plymouth shootings this year, with the deaths of 5 people in the UK, and seen some growing indications. I wonder if there's any further discussions, or have you included any of the male supremacist kind of violence in the database at all?
Well, thanks, Cynthia, for raising that incredibly difficult question. No, I'm just kidding. Yes, we have a list of principal cases that we have been, I guess, we're still trying to find some time to really go into the details of this. We have noted several events this year, unfortunately, that qualify as incel violence in Europe, and we have to take a stance on it. There's a few other principled events. I'll try to let you, this might be a good occasion to give you some insights into all the different dilemmas we are when trying to code this kind of violence. So one challenge that we have had is attacks against LGBT plus the target group, because we know that these victims may also be targeted by other types of perpetrators. So for that particular group, our general rule has been that in order for it to be included in our data set, there has to be some indication in the evidence that the perpetrator was somehow influenced by or affiliated with the far right. So in that case, we will include it. Otherwise, we won't include it so far. And I think there's a possibility that we might land on a similar solution for incel violence. Also because we know there are examples of, I just read a fascinating book in Swedish about incels in Sweden, which was a guy who's interviewed actually many incels, and clearly some of those guys wouldn't fit a far-right profile, just simply because they come from other parts of the world, or they might even identify actually as left-wing oriented. So I think we'd probably land on a similar, so we won't exclude or include it by definition, but we will look at the broader profile. Other things, similar difficult topics we've been struggling with lately is, and this relating to the event that Maik just told about from Sweden, children's violence. Should we have an age limit? How young can you be and do politically motivated violence? Can a 10-year-old do it? Can a 12-year-old do it? What should be the age limit? I think we landed now on the crime punishment age averaged for all the countries included, which ended up on 14 years. Another one is racist violence committed by ethnic minorities. Should that be included? I'm not even going to go into that discussion now because that's really a big question. But yeah, these are some of the dilemmas that we're confronted with, and hopefully we'll find some reasonable solution. They will never be perfect. Thanks for the question.
Great, thank you.
Are there any other comments or questions?
I would have one for Ashton and Cynthia, maybe, because I came across you just had like in the links that you had like of this one user that you had, and I always came across it as DeviantArt as a platform, as a kind of it's a kind of gateway also into far-right extremism. I mean, the idea, or like, if I'm not mistaken, the founder of the Iron March Forum has been like in the first place, or before he made this forum, he has been very active on this platform and producing very much visual materials and so on. So I was just wondering if you see there, I mean, in the image production, also in the kind of Feshwave artist in quotation marks, how you see like art, or what is supposed to be art in the eyes of these users plays a key role, or an important role in not just in communicating, but also like in more or less more and more identifying like with more extreme views as well, especially.
Yeah, I think that's important. Interestingly, all of the propaganda on Fascist Forge and Iron March that is on DeviantArt has not been taken down. So having that platform open allows them to sort of circumvent the restrictions that they might have on other platforms. You see Fash Wave propaganda on there as well. Actually, DeviantArt was the platform of choice for me when I was actually taking the data for my thesis, because there's just so much available on there and it's all linked. In terms of artwork, I've certainly seen that they frame themselves as these kind of skilled propagandists working for this cause, right? And it's almost as if they have competitions with each other on the platforms as well, like who gets the most information, who gets the most sort of response to the images and stuff, and newcomers to the forum will put their images into that as well and ask them to kind of be judged. And I think that is, personally, in my experience, a way that they kind of rank up the propagandists. But I mean, I don't know if you can take them seriously as artists in their own right. But no, I think that is a problem. And certainly for me, I actually used the data dump of Iron March as my like tester for the OSINT before I did Fascist Forge. And it was really interesting to see that most people had a DeviantArt account. So I think it's definitely like a prerequisite, like they're all on there. And if anyone goes on there, everything's linked, right? So you can Google Nazi symbol and then you're open to the thousands and thousands and thousands of swastika-based images that no one's really bothering to take down.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Okay. Yeah. If there aren't any other questions, I'll go on with my questions and the questions of the audience at first, and let's see what happens. Because I've got a very basic question, which might turn out a little bit complicated. But it's a general thing. We're talking about this cultural and also organizational switch in this area, in this phenomenon of right-wing extremist terrorism and mobilization. And I mean, this exposing themselves on the internet, I mean, it's two-sided thing. It's a Janus-faced thing, because I mean, after all, the internet is a public sphere, and we know where it comes from because it follows the cultural trend and also the needs of expression of a younger generation, of course, and and even those forums, they aren't really private, aren't they? And doesn't that mean that there is always the risk to for right-wing extremists and terrorists or the people from that movement to reveal their strategies and their motivations and their codes and all that, their plans on the internet? And doesn't that outweigh the propaganda and communication potential of the internet in the end? And what I mean, in other words, could there be a great risk that the right-wing extremist terror submerges again? And now we can see it in the internet, in those phenomenons. But what do you think? Yeah, isn't that from their perspective not that clever at all, that it's so visible on the internet?
Well, I can take a stab at that. It's a really interesting question. I think there are a couple of different things I would say. One, on this, there's so many things happening simultaneously with the evolution of far-right extremism in particular, but also, and I think I saw a question in the YouTube chat related to this, with the merging and blending of it into other kinds of extremism and the crossover, the way that people are kind of picking up fragments of ideologically extreme ideas online as they click on things. And so it's a very patchwork kind of situation right now. Sometimes I call it a choose your own adventure form. So, we've seen this with rising eco-fascism. We've seen it with far-right groups that say they are pro-LGBTQ, for example, although typically that hasn't been the case because they say they're supporting Western values, against a supposed threat to Western values from immigration and Islam. So, we're seeing strange coalitions, particularly in the US, but also I think overseas, between anti-maskers, anti-government extremists, white supremacists. January 6th was like a case study in that of the coalitions of people coming together from across a whole spectrum just by finding the lowest common denominator. In that case, the disinformation about an election, even though they would not normally cooperate or agree with each other, even on their objectives or goals. And that included the militant extreme right, but also just sort of ordinary pro-Trump supporters who were mobilized spontaneously to violent action on that day in some would say very predictable ways. And I think the intelligence showed that, but in other ways less predictable. So that's just to say that I think even though there's so much out there online and there's so much organization within some of these hierarchical cells, that where I think the real danger is involving or not the real danger, but one particular danger, a growing danger, is this very difficult and amorphously quickly evolving type of extremist patchwork ideas and ideology and mobilizations that seem to be also mobilizing people to political violence, not even necessarily terrorist or extremist violence, but political violence in quite rapid ways. So we're seeing that now against healthcare workers, against teachers, against school board, elected officials who are resigning in large numbers because they don't want to deal with. So the breakdown of systems as a result of the threat of political violence, which isn't even necessarily ideologically motivated in the ways that we traditionally think of ideological motivation. So it's still political violence, but it's not traditional terrorism as we understand it. And that makes it very hard to fight from an intelligence or security perspective again, because you can't. So even if you're mapping this out online and they're out there, what's legal, what's not legal, what's predictable, what's not, is really changing quickly. And then the threats of violence that are not coming from traditional forms of mobilization, but actual attacks on frontline workers, let's say right now, is a really sort of a different and evolving. And of course, we've seen rising assassination and attacks on elected officials across Europe and in the US as well. So it's not just frontline workers, it's also, the state itself that's under attack. So I'll stop talking, but I don't know if that answers it. It's yes, you're right, absolutely, that they're kind of putting themselves out there, but it's proven very, very hard to link that in a preventative way to enforcement. And also, I think it's where actual violent threats come from are evolving so quickly, it's very difficult to link some of that stuff until after the fact. So that's just one of the things I think that is worth mentioning.
Maybe I can just build a little bit on what Cynthia said, because I have some similar perspectives. I think perhaps sometimes it can be wise to try to take a step back and ask, what is it that we're really looking at here? And I think looking at all this through a terrorism prism is not necessarily what's going to give us most of the knowledge. I think, yes, terrorism can sometimes be an outcome of these online subcultures. But I think probably, like Cynthia said, other forms of political violence that is much less strategic, less organized, less ideologically bounded is probably a much more relevant outcome than terrorism. And possibly also a type of outcome that has a greater impact, negative impact on society as a whole. So I think applying also other perspectives, and in particular, like some of the work that Cynthia has been doing on subcultural perspectives, trying to understand that it's other drivers as well. And although many of these actors like to appropriate a terrorist logic and a terrorist symbolism, it's not necessarily advantageous to sort of apply traditional terrorist scholarship to understand it. So I think that's something that we need to think more about, and basically just do more mixed disciplines, I guess.
Mm-hmm.
Just to pick up on what Jacob said, sorry, Jacob, I pronounced it in an English way, sorry, very rude. Yeah, so I actually argue, my thesis is interdisciplinary, so it's criminology, history, and computer science. And although it was a nightmare to learn those disciplines and work in that way, I do personally think that that is going to be the way forward to try and tackle the sort of larger scale issues, because I think that when you're stuck in a silo, I think it's a bit difficult to think about the other components of it. And I do agree that I think that that is going to be something that helps us when we move forward, understanding the different levels. Personally, for me, it was the history. If I hadn't learned the history of basically what you see in Breivik and Tarrant's narratives, it's really difficult to understand how it all fits together as a puzzle now to reach out to so many people. So yeah, I do think interdisciplinary work is a good way forward.
Okay.
Shall I just, I don't know if I have much substantially to add. I think most things have been said, but I mean, the question, if I got it right, what makes a terrorist today, like in digital context? And I think this is, yeah, this is very much up to, yeah, what's really, I mean, it has never been easier to get the terrorist in a way to get this media attention that you need to, I mean, it's not, as we know, like it's not the act itself, it's in a way like how this act is being communicated. And I think there has, I mean, also before, a long time before, the concept of stochastic terrorism, that idea that there are like out there groups, terrorist groups that use the media as indirect enablers to address people to use terrorist violence. I mean, this is, I mean, a bit contested, this concept, but what I just, why I bring it up is today, that today it's not like that there is the need of a specific group to take this initiative to try to fill the volume in a way that someone, or like this idea that someone would use violence then. But today it's as long as everyone can send, as long as anyone can be a producer of materials that encourage violence, that maybe, or give a certain to give it a direction, a certain aggression, a certain yeah, whatever. So I think this is the big question in a way, like how do we try to make sense of like what is the real motivation of a perpetrator? I know, like in Oslo you make it okay, it's target selection, but as we just said, like we have so many complex ways in what kind of acting a certain ideology can translate, and yeah, I think it will be more difficult and more difficult in future to find for us patterns to analyze them and to try to make sense also in the long historical view on terrorism, on right-wing terrorism. How do we put this this recent wave of online mediated violence into the whole history of right-wing terrorism?
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, we had one question on YouTube, and Cynthia, I think you already mentioned it a little bit about the anti-vaxxers and the anti-COVID policy protesters. And the question goes like this. In the UK, there seems to be an amalgamation of football hooligans with RWE undertones and anti-vaxxers. Are right-wing extremists and anti-vaxxers visibly joining globally? And this question doesn't only go to Cynthia. I mean, maybe other of you can add something.
Yeah, we are absolutely seeing that in the States. I mean, it's more complicated, I would say, than just the anti-vaxxers and right-wing extremists or white supremacists. It's really a much broader coalition, in part brought together by things like QAnon, which also has drawn people into the conspiracy world, and then the intersections with anti-shelter-in-place orders that began at US state capitals a year and a half ago. And so the anti-government, the anti-masking protests, anti-vax protests, which also have drawn in some people traditionally from the left, because anti-vax, there's always been anti-vax communities in the US, but they are usually almost always on the far left, kind of very opposed to traditional medicine, opposed to some traditional science, medical science. So that's where it gets really messy. That's why I sometimes call them strange coalitions. And what we have been seeing is that those coalitions can come together in violent action, even when they don't actually agree on many things, by finding the lowest common denominator that they do agree on. And so I think what we should be looking for are, possible volatile points. So we know that elections are won in the US. We know that vaccine mandates, as we're having now, are also causing that. So, the answer is absolutely yes, but not quite in the way of actually forming a coalition where it might persist, but rather around potentially violent events, I think, that can happen when people agree to come together in protest of something, even though they don't agree on the main objectives of each other's groups, if that makes sense. And that was something in the US, at least, that had, the far right had tried to do that before and failed in what they actually called the Unite the Right rally. They tried to come together across a wide variety of disparate groups. But now they're able to do it both through the coronavirus kind of vaccine and masking issues, and I think because of election disinformation.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. We're talking about different blends of ideology and things coming together, or strange alliances. Cynthia, has that white ethno-state ideology you were talking about and you were explaining, it has internationally unified the radical right, from the US to Ukraine and all sorts of countries, and they are united in those white supremacy beliefs. Has that replaced the old traditional nationalism and chauvinism altogether? Or does it work simultaneously?
Yeah, it's really interesting. I think we've always had, it's a great question. We've always had this sort of contradictory tensions between the global and the national when it comes to white supremacist extremist movements, where they are often simultaneously nationalistic, but drawing on global networks or global symbols, and sometimes even across ideologies. So to sort of present themselves as freedom fighters or whatever the logic is. So I've seen German neo-Nazis wearing Gandhi t-shirts, t-shirts with Gandhi quotes, or wearing Palestinian scarves, as we've seen, or even in one controversial case, Che Guevara t-shirts, because these are all ways to represent themselves, they think, as freedom fighters or fighting an oppressive government or things like that, even though it doesn't actually ideologically make sense. So there's always been these kinds of global global connections and shared ideals expressed in a nationalist way. But what we are seeing even a little bit more of now, so the recent attacks in Germany in Hanau and Halle, where the terrorist actor or violent actor either wrote their manifesto in English or tried to live stream in English. So they're acting in a way that is nationally oriented against a so-called national enemy, but performing it for a global audience in the hopes of inspiring other nationalist attacks. So I think what you see in the States, at least, is that white ethno-state, there is an actual map that they circulate. I mean, white supremacist extremists do have a territorial idea of where that would be that is tied to a geography that is within the US. But they are also clearly trying to inspire, motivate, and take inspiration from global actors who are doing the same things in their own country. So that's one way. And then the other, I think, is that there's been a shared migration to a grand conspiracy theory called the Great Replacement theory, which has unified what used to be regionally specific conspiracy theories, one called white genocide in the US and the one in Europe called Eurabia, that really were specific to geographic and demographic issues within regions. And now, though, that Great Replacement theory has motivated terrorist actors against Latino immigrants, against, in Texas, against Muslims in Christchurch, against Jews in Pittsburgh and in California. So, and then in Norway as well, against, I think that was a attempted mosque attempt. So you had, many different terrorist actors across countries motivated by a grand conspiracy theory, but still acting out in some way nationally. So it's complex, but I think very deeply intertwined.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. Ashton, you talked about those ideological flip-floppers, as you call them, on fascist forge and in other on other platforms and so on. And there's a question from one person in our Zoom audience, which goes like this. What do you think are the main reasons for the flip-floppers to switch from the extreme left to the extreme right? Are there any new insights in the recent past?
Yeah, so those of us that are political scientists will know about the political horseshoe. So generally people think politics goes one way or the other. Some people use the political compass as well. What I've found is that it starts off with people disliking capitalism with very reasonable reasons. Might start off liking a bit of Karl Marx, go to a bit of anarchism. So it generally starts off with a huge disdain for capitalism that then slowly escalates to, well, who's in control of capitalism? Who's in control of all of this industry? And then you get the extremely anti-Semitic rhetoric springboarding off of that. And quite a lot of the time they will flip around to very anti-Semitic, blaming the Jews for that. So that's personally what I've seen manifesting on these particularly insular forums.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's interesting. You really took a deep dive into the ideological side of things there. And maybe you can answer another question which comes from our YouTube audience about those religious things. And talking about the occult-inspired and so-called esoteric Hitlerists or self-acclaimed Hitlerists. The question goes like this: where was their occult knowledge coming from? What do you think, Ashton?
I have a whole chapter in my thesis called Folk Tales in the Führer, the supernatural propaganda of the virtual Reich. And it's all about the intersection of occult-based narratives in different far-right movements. So I use eco-fascist groups, QAnon, the alt-right, for example. The knowledge, it depends where you're coming from with this, because the danger is with the occult is a lot of people have started focusing on springboards off of fascist forge, like the Order of Nine Angles, right? So specifically neo-Nazi groups with really serious like satanic beliefs. I look at the way that occult symbols are intersecting with the mainstream, and I don't talk about mainstreaming as a one-directional process, but rather the fringe and the mainstream work together in a mutually reinforcing loop. So Disney's a really good example of this. You can have a meme that's Disney. I use the Cinderella ball scene, for example. There's a meme that's Disney that you wouldn't necessarily know was extreme at all, unless you're unpicking the narrative of where it's being disseminated. And you see this with the occult as well. Now, I personally don't think that the people that are using these terms on these forums have a blind clue of what the actual history of the occult with National Socialism is. I don't think they know anything about the Weimar years, all of the kind of esoteric components that really helped create the Third Reich, which is the history that I go into. And the way that this intersects now with like eco-fascism, you have the history of ecology with Nazi Germany, but they will use it to code and cloak their narratives. But I don't truly believe that they understand the history of what they're talking about at all. So I think they use the occult to sound edgy, to code and cloak their narratives, but I don't necessarily think that they are following some satanic version. I think it's just a masquerade to make themselves seem a bit more edgy. They don't know what's going on with the occult. They don't know the history. This is like when people try and claim that they're kind of history buffs about it, right? They don't actually know. I talk about the weaponization of history, like the Crusades, like what Cynthia was saying about the different narratives around the Great Replacement. In my thesis, I argue that Western civilization has become the latest dog whistle to mask these kind of really insidious racist policies. Behind the Crusades, there's this idea amongst the occultists on neo-Nazi forums that we need to go back to ancient Greece, ancient Rome, and that's the way that society ought to be. So they kind of harken back to these epochs where Western civilization was dominant, and they will use whether it's the occult, whether it's Sparta, right? Anything they can basically grapple at that will have some sort of trace to masculinity, dominance, they will use in their imagery, because it's much more difficult to suspend a crusade image than it is a swastika. And you see this with the occult as well. And I think that that's quite important, because they are utilizing mainstream imagery to propel these narratives as such.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Jakob, Muslim radical groups or Islamist groups like ISIS and so on frequently calling for lone attacks. And they really focused on the propaganda to get people into action, and specifically called for lone attacks. And in their magazines and various online propaganda. Have you seen similar calls in the right-wing extremist online or offline communities before an attack, so that we can link this cause for action specifically to the monitored events?
That's I think that's a sort of causal relationship that will be very difficult to establish, because there are calls for action every second, I think, across the sort of the online sphere. So firstly, there's a lot of lone actors on the extreme right that take inspiration also from ISIS and other groups, including Breivik was very much influenced by Al-Qaeda. But of course, the original calls for lone actor terrorism came from the extreme right back in the 70s and the 80s. So this is not something new, it's something that's been there all the time. I must say that I'm one thing that I'm struck by, which I would be interested to hear the other panelists' thoughts about. So some of the research that I presented today shows that in terms of, well, at least in terms of the most severe violence and in terms of terrorist violence, there's not been a massive increase. Actually, some forms of violence have decreased over the past decades. But at the same time, what we can indeed establish is that the amount of extreme right terrorist propaganda material that is available to people globally has grown exponentially over the past few years. And in that sense, it seems like an odd relationship. You would expect with all this propaganda that there would be more violence. So again, I'm sort of questioning, how should we interpret this? Is really terrorist violence the outcome that we should be looking for? What are the implications? What is it that we're really looking at? Because, like I said, and like you said, there are calls for lone actor terrorism every day, every minute, but they usually don't materialize. So what is this then? I don't have the answer, by the way.
Mm-hmm. Does anybody of you want to comment on that?
I mean, not with an answer, a definite answer. But maybe I can try to make the loop to your question, because I found it interesting, like the connection to ISIS and in the Islamist context. Because I mean, what is striking is that at least in the public discourse, when you had an Islamist terrorist attack, it would be enough for the person to have a picture of an ISIS flag to be said to be member of the Islamic State and a would-be soldier of this, or a soldier of this would-be caliphate. In the public discourse, it was very easy to get affiliated to this organization, and mostly it was just when ISIS was claiming responsibility. If this person would ever have a direct order to perpetrate any kind of violence, or if this person would just be a free rider, or would just act on the own on the own preferences. I mean, this works very differently in the public discourse, in the Islamist context and in the right-wing extremist context, because normally it's easy to affiliate Islamist terrorism to a specific organization, because this organization often claim to have soldiers in all the world, even though they may never have a contact to the organization. But in the right-wing context, we look first of all at that, or we ask ourselves, okay, is this a lone actor? Is this a lone wolf? And there's no organization that would claim that that global incidences, or like even national incidents of violence, all are connected to a certain group if this person is not really direct affiliated to the group. And coming back to Jacob's question, then is I see it similar to you. I mean, if I've been like on HN the day when this Christchurch attack happened, and it was, yeah, if you read this, you feel like, okay, there are so many people, and it's just a matter of time until it happens again. And this makes you, I think this is this doesn't make, I mean, this makes us in a way very, very worried what can be happen and what is possible to be happening. But yeah, I see the same, like in a way we have now a mean to monitor various communication flows that we would not have before. We see so many people communicating at the same time, but this is also the challenge, like to dissect, okay, what is of importance in a way for larger patterns, and what is just in a way also motivated by a certain platform culture, by a certain behavior online. And there is such an online subculture that has so established ways to communicate. But yeah, I think also it brings us, or we should not exclusively look at terrorism. We should think more in longer standards, like how also public discourse change, how this changes public discourse, how public discourse is reacting to this, and how people feel, or what people feel interested, or what people feel like is speaking to them in this kind of propaganda, because it doesn't stop, as you said, but yeah, the viewers really take the consequence that those who produce the materials would like to see.
We need more research, Maik.
Just
yes, but also research doesn't solve all the problems, I would say. I think there are also things that we cannot totally quantify, that we cannot just understand by measuring it. I think there are a lot of stuff that is going on online is emotions in a way, and that they're really difficult to measure. It's not just, it's not all.
One thing that might be worth mentioning is that if you look at the online behavior of those who actually end up carrying out lone actor attacks, they do deviate often from some of the standardized subcultural online extremist behavior. They're usually far less active than many other users, and they're not necessarily very extreme in their statements. And what we're seeing in terms of, because you asked about sort of, are we seeing online triggers just before attacks? And I would say that what we're actually seeing is that we do see triggers involved some attacks, but they're usually offline. Or it's usually the offline context that actually explain the trigger event. Although the individual can be 100% radicalized online, it's an offline condition that explains the timing of the attack. So just an example, the attack in Bærum against this mosque that Cynthia referred to, this perpetrator was fully, radicalized online within these subcultures, but the timing of his attack was conditioned by the first time that both of his stepmom and his father was out of the house, and he could just move freely around the house. So, yeah, the relationship between online behavior and offline behavior is very, very complex and complicated, and we certainly need to look at them sort of in parallel to, if we're going to ever get anywhere near of sort of predicting behaviors, if at all possible.
Jakob, one quick question from the Zoom audience about the police records. Has there been a change in how far those cases have been classified as terrorism or psychological disturbed lone wolves also? Can you say something about that? On the one hand, incidents of white supremacist terrorism, and on the other hand, those cases of the psychological disturbed lone wolf. Has there been a switch, if I get it right?
Sure. So let me just first mention that a common misunderstanding based on the data that we are producing is that it's based on police data, which it is not. It's solely based on our own sort of research using open sources. But we do monitor police data on both hate crimes and political violence. And yes, there's changes all the time, both in how they code and conceptualize events, which make police data very problematic, but also, of course, how the public and the media frame these events and so on. And I think, there's been a valid criticism for some time that, like Maik also briefly mentioned, that if there's an Islamist perpetrator, they will receive the terrorist label immediately, whereas when there's an extreme right perpetrator, you will often more read about crazy people and so on. But I think that's changed. At least that's my take on it over the past few years, that one has become much more aware of this problem and how it's also sort of being perceived in a very negative way by minorities and Muslim minorities and so on. So I think there's more attention to this now. I know in Norway, where we just had an incident, the police is now very careful about what to label as terrorism, and they're always waiting for it. And I guess I should mention, relating to this last event in Norway now, that what they're saying right now is that all arrows are pointing in another direction than terrorism, that it's a more psychiatric case, this one. So, yeah.
Yeah, difficult. Cynthia, this the entire phenomenon seems to be a rather male one. What actually are the trends or the developments in the involvement of women in the processes you described, and the online cultures and so on?
Yeah, great question. Thank you for that. So we have been seeing increasing engagement of women, especially in online spaces. One of the reasons why I think that's the case is because women's engagement in offline, especially on the white supremacist side, where they would engage through, let's say, the Ku Klux Klan in the US, or through white supremacist extremist terrorist groups, if they wanted to do that, if either they weren't allowed or there was extreme misogyny, harassment, and even sometimes assaults, happening within those groups. And so the participation of women in those types of movements was very difficult or impossible, except as helpers. Of course, we always say that, when you're talking about something like the Ku Klux Klan, I mean, somebody was sewing those uniforms, right? And that often was women. So you can't underestimate the power of some of those behind the scenes roles that women provided as helpers, and have provided as helpers and enablers of these movements for many, many years. But in the online space, women are emerging much more as leaders of, talk shows, of YouTube channels, where they're exploiting the fact that they can take a leadership role now and escape some of that violence and misogyny that's also directed against women, and do much more of the recruitment on their own. And so there are and Evian Leidig, who I don't think is in the audience, but has written a wonderful manuscript about this, about the role of women in online movements. And there's quite a lot happening in a younger generation of scholarship about it as well. We also see more women involved in far-right political parties, and even now recently in the US, in the militant anti-government extremist movements, which we really saw quite visibly in the attack on the US Capitol, with one of the women in the unlawful militia movements there being in charge of some of the communication happening on that day. As and then the last thing I'll say is that women, of course, have been brought into this big tent of strange coalitions through the anti-vax and through the QAnon movements as well, the QAnon broader conspiracy theories, in part, sometimes even through connections to the wellness community. So there's yoga, kind of recruitment happening in some of those movements in the US, from yoga, wellness, alternative medicine communities that intersect with some of that anti-government, anti-vax, as well as the anti-masking communities and the attacks on school board and teachers that we're seeing. So it's a much, much bigger and more varied role for women. Again, that's not just on terrorism, that's just in a broader kind of political violence framework. And I think we have to be clear about these definitions, which are extremely messy in the US and internationally. We don't even have a common definition across our own agencies of what white supremacist extremism is in the US, much less terrorism, domestic violent extremism we're using. It's a wide variety of terms. So when I'm talking here, I'm talking more broadly about political violence and extremism as well as the terrorist fringe. But in general, yes, we're seeing much more women's engagement in the public-facing side of that and in the violent action than we had been seeing in the past. And we've seen that also in recent attacks in Germany. However, it's still the far minority of violent actors are women, and statistics on that bear that out. This is almost overwhelmingly the violence comes from men. particularly on the terrorist fringe, and I would expect that to remain the case.
Ashton, do you second to that, or could you elaborate on that a little bit in terms of the fascist fringe or the far-right radical and terror-oriented online communities? Yeah, are women facing a different role today there, or what was the development?
Well, on the fascist forums, you're actually not allowed to go on if you're a woman. So I don't see them on there in the kind of niche 1.0 platforms. Yeah, I would agree with what Cynthia said. You see a lot of intersections between Instagram, for example, like women who are... For me, in my research, the big thing was COVID mixing with eco-fascism and like mummy bloggers on Instagram. So people that you would see the same image on Instagram of a family out in the woods, for example, for a walk. And you would see the narrative around like, oh, you know, getting back to nature because we've got so much more time now to cook from scratch because we're at home with our families and we're outside with the dog going on these lovely walks. You would see the same image on an identitarian Twitter account, for example, or Telegram account. And then you would see the same image on VK in an eco-fascist account. And depending on the narrative, these groups can intersect really neatly. And there's a really fine line between like being concerned about the planet and resources tipping into like neo-Malthusian overpopulation rhetoric. Now, I'm not a scholar of gender as such. I don't study specifically gender and extremism, but what I have seen is this intersection with the concern around wellness, as Cynthia was saying, mixing in with eco-fascism. The most women I've seen are in eco-fascist communities. In terms of, in the 4 years I've been online, that is where I've seen, and of course QAnon. QAnon is massive, and the intersection with all different types of extremism there is really prominent. But yeah, I would agree that I think that women are playing more of a role now, particularly as propagandists, whether or not they necessarily are aware that they're even engaging in those narratives. I personally think a lot of people don't. And that's the point of sort of us decoding and decloaking that and making people aware.
Mm-hmm. Okay, thank you. So I think we're gonna have a quick final round, and of course with Institute for Democracy and Civil Society, one question is left, which I spared for the final round, and I would ask everybody maybe that she or he can say something about it. And this, as always, the most difficult question: what could be or should be proper intervention strategies and repressive measures? And let's start with Maik. What do you think? What should be done? What can society do?
Yeah, what should be done? I think those measures that we know how to contain and how to repress right-wing extremism do not perfectly apply anymore in the digital, in an increasingly digitalized society. I think as all the problems that we discussed today are not so easy to pinpoint. We don't know. It's not so easy to cut off a head and then, like literally speaking, of course, and the head of an organization, and it's there's too much out there to have it like the old way to repress it. And I think it would be, of course, a large debate, but I think in the long run, we need to reconsider like how or whom we leave the authority to leave millions and billions of people to communicate and to ask if it's good to have it in private hands, such potent online communication spaces, and to really consider how how communication in social media platforms needs to look like. And I think this is also what I tried to explain before. We have such, I mean, this is such a revolutionary way that everyone can publish whatever, wherever he or she wants. And I think this brings so many problems, because once it's out, it has to be deleted, and there start the problems. Who is in charge? Who makes the rules? And how is it applied? And I think there are so many advantages, of course, that the new media technologies have brought with us, but they are made to be exploited, and there are people making money with it. And there is, I mean, over the past years, there have been people getting rich with distributing racist propaganda. And I think to understand this, like how much this influenced also the way how right-wing extremism changed throughout the last years. I think it is not very popular, but I think we need to have an open debate how we can, in a way, build social media that are that have a public overview, that needs to be legitimized by democratic governments, and that, yeah, we need to think if it's really the best way that everyone can publish whenever and whatever he or she wants. I think this is so normal today in our everyday communication, in our everyday life. Yeah, this, I think the damage is there already, and it's difficult to close the box of the Pandora, but I think we need to rethink in the long run how democratic communities, the societies should communicate, and this makes so much of this problem that we discussed today.
Mm-hmm. Okay, Cynthia. And I'm asking for a short question because time is running up.
I'll do it very quickly, which is, and I promise I was using this metaphor before the pandemic, but I think for many years we have looked at extremism across the ideological spectrum, but especially from the far right, as if could be treated like a tumor. We can just isolate it, cut it out of society, keep everybody else untouched from it, and it won't affect us. But in fact, it spreads much more like a virus, and we don't know enough about why some people are more resilient than others, maybe kind of naturally, but what we do know is you can build immunity to it. And so, I would argue that we need to invest much more in the mainstream to create more resilience to propaganda, to disinformation, to help people recognize the persuasive tactics of extremist groups. At the same time as we have to work on shutting down and the security, the law enforcement, the deplatforming perspectives, but those kinds of perspectives will always be a band-aid, and the more that we have going into that pipeline, the more risk there is. So I would argue for more investments in like Maik was saying, strengthening democracy, but also digital literacy and media literacy to help equip people with the tools to really be more resilient.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. Jakob.
Yeah, the $1 million question. So as I was hinting to in my presentation, actually in December this year, I'm beginning a 4-year project that's going to look at repression and far-right terrorism. So you should ask me in 4 years' time, but I'll try to give you an answer now as well. So I think the first question we have to ask is, what is it that we want to repress? Because the far-right universe is large and it consists of many different elements. And I think a common mistake is to treat it as if there's a catch-all solution to all of it. We need to distinguish between different elements. Do we want to repress IDs? Do we want to repress physical actions? Do we want to repress online statements and so on? And then the next question, once you identified what element you want to repress, is what drives it? And then to what extent can those drivers be manipulated? So I believe in scaled and configured repression. Repression is very complex. It can, produce a counterproductive effects. So that's also why we need more comparative research on this. But that's all I can say for now, and hopefully I will have more solid and evidence-based answers in the future.
Okay, thank you. And Ashton, finally, last but not least.
I'll be super quick. I think we need more interdisciplinary research, more people to work together, and more decoding and decloaking of the narratives and the intersection, the fuzzy boundaries between the mainstream and the fringe, which are allowing so many narratives to kind of fly under the radar of social media companies, take down algorithms. So yeah, short and sweet. Okay,
thank you. Yeah, I thank all of you. And ladies and gentlemen, dear guests, dear colleagues, we now reached the end of the session. And I'd like to thank everybody, and first and foremost, of course, our speakers for their contributions again. And of course, I would also like to thank for all the questions and comments and statements in the discussion. Instead of trying to make an incomplete summary and time is running up, I'd like to invite everybody to take a deeper dive into Cynthia's, Ashton's, Jakob's, and Maik's scientific publications and their research, as well as to follow them on social media. And we would also be honored and would be glad if you could visit our website, IDZ's website, for more information on our research and publications. And for our German-speaking audience, please also take notice for the notice of the further program of the current Kein Schlussstrich series of cultural, scientific, and community events focusing on the NSU terrorism and its history and commemorating practices in the civil society and learnings and future strategies, how to deal with right-wing extremist terror, racism, violence, anti-Semitism, and group-focused enmity in our societies. Anyway, that's it. Thank you all for being with us tonight, and special thanks to all my colleagues in the background for their great help and technical support. Goodbye, everyone.